I want to begin by saying that although this is a virtual presentation, we are all rooted in place and space. So I want to acknowledge that McMaster University, where I work, is situated in the territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations, covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. So today I'm delighted to talk about a project that we've been working on for quite a while now. And it's a project that has to do with truth commissions and the politics of memory. Much of what we're doing has to do with, like Dominic says, a comparison of truth commissions around the world. And so in the 30 or so minutes I have to present to you today some of my thoughts on these issues, I'd like to start by kind of framing my conversations. I would like to start by introducing you to the Confronting Atrocity project, which is where much of this work comes from. And then I'll make some arguments for truth commissions, because there are certainly those who do not think truth commissions are a good idea. I would look at the South African model. I would look at the Canadian model. And then, crucially, I'll be talking about the place of history and the politics of memory, which is really at the crux of the conversation this afternoon. I will conclude with some reflections on truth commissions, justice, and reconciliation. So let me say something about our project. It's called the Confronting Atrocity Project. This is a project that's about 3-4 years old now. And what we've set out to do is that we've tried to look at truth commissions from around the world. We've acknowledged that there's a growing popularity of truth commissions. Nations are increasingly establishing truth commissions to deal with historical injustices. And we wanted a center where we could work together to think about these truth commission practices, particularly in relation to the archives. So when truth commissions finish their work, they're typically a treasure trove of archives they leave behind. And what we've tried to do at the center is really document these archives. So we have a database, we have a repository of publicly available Truth Commission records from around the world. At the last count, about 40 Truth Commission records we have in our database, and it's allowed us to do some in-depth analysis of this data. And this is an example of the kind of work we do. We go into the archives of the Truth Commission. Here you see a statement, an original statement from the Sierra Leone Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And we look at the records, I mean, at least those that are publicly available. And where possible, we go back to those who participated in the Truth Commission processes, whether they be victims or alleged perpetrators or state officials or international NGO workers. And we go back to them and we interview them. Typically, we are asking 5-10 years after you participated in this Truth Commission, has anything changed? Has anything worked? And we're also interested how Truth Commission processes challenges hegemonic narratives of national histories. So it's painstaking work that involves going back to the records, but also doing individual interviews and focus group interviews with those involved. So let us talk about truth commissions, the growing popularity of truth commissions. You know, it's been said that if the last century marked the age of human rights, the 21st century is shaping up to become the age of truth commissions. And the reason for that is that since truth commissions were first experimented with in Latin America in the 1970s, it has just exploded around the world. Almost every nation, it seems, is exploring opportunities to establish truth commissions as a way of dealing with long-standing historical atrocities. Truth commissions have also been deployed as a way of dealing with contemporary human rights violations. So as you can see from the chart here, from 1974 to 2009, there's been an exponential rise. And we're talking here only of national truth commissions. That's not counting what we call grassroots truth commissions. That is, truth commissions established by local communities to investigate atrocities within those particular communities. And since this record was taken in 2009, I can tell you that, there have been maybe another 20 truth commissions that have been established around the world. And so the motivation for our project is really, what is the rationale, behind these rush to establish truth commissions? And more importantly, do they work? Is there value in this? So it is against this background that we initiated this project that we've been working on. So I've just talked about the explosion in interest in Truth Commission. And, we know that in Canada, we recently had our own Truth and Reconciliation Commission focused on Indigenous people. But if you look at all the Truth Commissions that have been established around the world, they come in all shapes and sizes. The common denominator seems to be truth. Everyone wants to find the truth about a historical atrocity or a gross human rights violation. But truth is often combined with something else. In Brazil, it was simply just the Truth Commission in Brazil, Panama, and Peru. In Canada, South Africa, Honduras, it was Truth and Reconciliation. But most countries of the world actually do not have a reconciliation mandate, at least not an explicit reconciliation mandate in the work of their Truth Commission. So for instance, in Colombia and Gambia, the emphasis is on reparations because the harm done is seen mainly as economic, and the emphasis is on reparations. In Kenya, Haiti, and Mauritius, the emphasis is on justice, victim-centered justice. In Tunisia, the emphasis was on dignity. And these are actually the names of the Truth Commissions. This is how they were, framed. So in Tunisia is the Truth and Dignity Commission. In Guatemala is the Truth and Historical Clarification Commission. And this is a really interesting one for me as a historian, because from the very onset, the mandate of this Truth Commission is to clarify history, to rewrite national history, to contest national history. In Morocco, the emphasis was on equity. It's called the Equity and Reconciliation Commission. In Uruguay, it's the Commission for Peace. And in the Seychelles, the emphasis was on national unity. So as you can see, the vision of truth commissions are varied. But like I said before, the central theme here is finding the truth about a historical atrocity. So what are truth commissions? And very briefly, and we'll have opportunity to talk more about this hopefully in the question and answer sessions. Truth commissions are essentially quasi-judicial bodies aimed at addressing gross human rights violations and historical injustices. So the first truth commissions that emerged in Latin America and in Africa are really focused on authoritarian rule, the transition from authoritarian military rule to democracy, as in Chile, as in Argentina. In Africa, it had to do with conflict, as in Rwanda, as in Sierra Leone, as in Liberia. But more lately, we are seeing, particularly in Western democracies, truth commissions deployed to address not so much contemporary human rights violations, but historical injustice, as we see with the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission's charged with looking at the residential school system. And even as I speak, the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, they're thinking of their own truth commissions to deal with historical injustices against the indigenous Sami people of Scandinavia and Icelandic minorities within that community. In the United States, there's also talk about a truth commission for slavery, and there's actually a bill on the floor of the US Congress now for a truth commission to deal with slavery as a historical atrocity. Although significantly, the US bill omits any reference to reconciliation. So it's purely a truth commission. There have been more than 50 truth commissions globally. Actually, at our last count, we might have up to 60 now because truth commissions have been established every day. The Gambia recently established its own truth commission, so the number is rising. Some countries have multiple truth commissions. They establish one, and then 5 years down the road, they choose to establish another one. So that number is just going to grow. The central debate in legitimizing truth commission is this classic, intellectual and academic question. and tension between retributive justice and restorative justice. Those who advocate for truth commissions push truth commissions as an alternative or a complementary model of justice that can reinforce retributive justice. Retributive justice in this sense would refer to what we understand typically as justice. You know, if someone commits a crime, they get thrown in jail. Or if you're thinking about international relations, think about the War Crimes Tribunal or the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal. That would be a classic example of the retributive justice model in the aftermath of conflict, where the Nazi leaders were tried, or the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, some were executed and some were thrown in jail. Now, the idea of Truth and Reconciliation Commission is that that model in itself doesn't suffice, that for some societies, the retributive model does not bring closure, and that it does not really reconcile societies in the aftermath of conflict. And it is in this spirit that a country like South Africa, for instance, opted for a truth commission after the end of apartheid and its transition to democracy, rather than the classic retributive justice model. Now, what are the key goals of truth commissions? And I'm summarizing here so we can have time for the more substantive conversations about historical justice. The goals really are truth-seeking. At the heart of every truth commission is truth-seeking. Let us find out the truth about what happened. And it comes from a presumption that the truth is not known, or the truth has been obscured in national histories and in the national consciousness. And so that is the primary goal. The second common goal we see with truth commissions is victim-centered justice. That let us bring justice to these victims or their descendants who have suffered through abuse, in which very often the state is complicit. And finally, reconciliation. Now, this is not true of all truth commissions. There are many truth commissions that have absolutely no reconciliation mandate. In fact, in the scholarship of truth commissions, there are many who would argue that reconciliation has no place in the discourse of truth commissions. The state has no business reconciling citizens. That should be left to the private sphere, to religious organizations, to charities, not to the state. And so you would find a number of truth commissions that do not have an explicit reconciliation mandate, but most do. And so reconciliation is part of that. But there's also an often unspoken goal behind truth commission. It's not so much explicit, but the more you look at the workings of truth commissions, the more you realize that this might actually be the central goal: state building. That truth commissions are an instrument by which the state legitimizes itself. Beyond truth-seeking, victim-centered justice, or reconciliation, that the state is invested in truth commissions because in some ways it legitimizes its authority to continue. And this is a very interesting question that truth commission scholars are beginning to look at, and how truth commissions in themselves become a way by which states legitimize themselves, and not just states, but even ruling regimes. What are the outcomes of truth commissions? Typically investigations, which, they're quasi-judicial institutions, there are public hearings, there are prosecutions. In some cases, as in South Africa, there's amnesty to perpetrators, and this is a very controversial part of the mandate of truth commissions. There are reforms, institutional reforms, police reforms, judicial reforms, educational reforms. In the case of Canada, for instance, we have the 95 calls to action, the 94 calls to action, which are all intended to reform our Canadian society in response to the revelations of the Canadian TRC. In some cases, there are public apologies. We did get one here in Canada. The government did apologize for the residential school system. There is compensation, and often there is memorialization to kind of acknowledge the harm done. So these are just some of the parameters, because often one gets asked, what distinguishes a truth commission from, say, a commission of inquiry? There are many commissions of inquiry, and I would argue that it is the truth-seeking mandate that makes truth commissions stand out. So what is the value? And this, I'm getting more into the heart of my talk today. And this is really at the center of the debate. What is the value of truth commissions? Why is there such a flurry, such an explosion of truth commission? Why are states so eager to establish truth commissions? And not just states, mind you, the international community, the United Nations, where I currently work part-time, it's very invested in truth commissions and has pushed truth commissions in many post-conflict societies. In Liberia and Sierra Leone, the establishment of truth commissions in those countries were really motivated by the United Nations trying to push the South African model. So are they useful? I want to start with a quote by Michael Ignatieff, who's a distinguished political theorist and who many of you will recognize as if the one-time leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. Many people think of Michael Ignatieff as a politician, but long before he became a politician, he was a very distinguished political theorist. And Michael Ignatieff is a skeptic. Is a skeptic of truth commission. And he argues that we should be measured in what we think truth commissions can do. In one of his famous articles of Fate, he calls it, he writes, a truth commission cannot overcome a society's division. It can only winnow out the solid core of facts upon which society's argument with itself should be conducted. But it cannot bring these arguments to a conclusion. All that a truth commission can achieve, and here is the key point, is to reduce the number of lies that can be circulated unchallenged in public discourse. And I think that's a very profound statement. So what Michael Ignatieff is saying here is that, well, let's temper these expectations we have about truth commissions. You know, all they're really good for is that they reduce the number of lies that circulates in public discourse. So all that the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission did really was to just, you know, reduce the number of lies about the abuses in the residential school system. All that the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission did was to reduce the number of lies about the atrocities of apartheid. And on this, I respectfully disagree. And this is where I come in as a historian. And I ask, is that really all truth commissions do, reducing lies? I argue that truth commissions do a little bit more, but not so much in terms of the agenda that is set for themselves. So when scholars evaluate truth commission, very often the benchmarks are the agenda that truth commission sets for themselves, whether it be victim-centered justice, whether it be truth-seeking or reconciliation. And I argue that there's more that truth commissions do. Truth commission provides us with a means of contesting national histories, a way of rethinking narratives about history, about who belongs, about how society is structured, and that we should measure the efficacy and the value of truth commission, not simply along the parameters of what the report says, of what it delivers on in the immediate term, but in terms of the rich archives that it provides historians like myself to rewrite national histories. And for communities, not just historians like myself, but for communities to re-narrate their histories and to contest hegemonic national histories or reinscribe their own stories into national histories from which they've been excluded. And I argue that that is a very important outcome of truth commissions, and that if we're going to evaluate truth commissions holistically, we should think not just about the short and medium-term agendas of these truth commissions, but what they portend for how we rethink as societies. But before I go back to that, I want to speak a little bit more, and I know this is a series dedicated to Canadian history. So I want to start about the Canadian dimension to this global connection. And I'm starting here with a quote by Justice Sinclair, the chairman of the Canadian Residential School Truth Reconciliation Commission. At every opportunity he got, Justice Sinclair reminded the Canadian audience that the model for the Canadian Truth Commission was the South African Truth Commission. In the words of Justice Sinclair, we learned a great deal from South African Commission in terms of how to engage with survivors of atrocities, how to provide them with support in the course of their testimony, how to ensure that their sense of story was validated, and how to ensure that they understood the importance of not only truth-telling, but the importance of making contributions to reconciliation. And for those of us who do international human rights, this is significant Because you've got to understand that within international human rights discourse, the traditional narrative is that the global South goes to the global North to learn about human rights. Human rights violations, atrocities, dictatorships, all happened in the global South. And to get ideas about human rights, scholars, leaders, policymakers have to look to the liberal democracies of the global North to get ideas about how to address human rights violations. But with truth commissions, we see a reversal of this trend. Here is Canada, a Western liberal democracy, looking to South Africa for a model of justice. And I have to say that this yearning to look at the global South for models of justice comes not from the Canadian government, but from indigenous communities who are saying, in order to deal with this historical atrocity, South Africa provides us with a model. And you have to remember the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out of a legal case. So there was a traditional retributive justice system. But out of that legal case came a yearning for a restorative justice system. And indigenous people felt that South Africa would be the model for this. And this is the global interconnection that I think it's valuable to think about when we think about truth commissions, that they provide a new window in understanding transnational justice and the global consciousness about rights. Because the South African Truth Commission was itself influenced by the Chilean Truth Commission. So when Mandela came out of prison after 27 years of imprisonment, and the ANC government was thinking about how to move the country from many years of white minority rule and the atrocities of apartheid to a new democratic system, they went around the world in search for models. And Chile's Truth Commission became the model that South Africa built on. Of course, South Africa emphasized the amnesty provision, and there were some things that were unique to the South African experience. But it is this global borrowing that I think makes a study of truth commission so fascinating. How not just states are borrowing to each other, but marginalized groups within those communities are borrowing globally to address historical atrocities to which they've been subjected. There's one more irony to this story that I think bears mentioning. The great irony of Justice Sinclair and the Canadian Truth Commissions looking to South Africa for a model is that many years before, Canada became the model for the apartheid state in South Africa. So when the Nationalist Party in South Africa was looking for a model to kind of restrict and disenfranchise its majority Black population, one of the places it came to was here in Canada. It's very well documented, to study the reserves, to study how the reservations work and how Indigenous people were siloed in reserves and controlled in reserves. The instrumentality of the Indian Act was a model that these nationalist leaders, the leaders of the Nationalist Party in South Africa, came back with and said, here we have a model of how this could be done. And the township system that became the instrument of apartheid, the Bantustans, were to a large extent built along the Canadian reservation system. So it is ironic, and kind of, the paradox of history that half a century later, Indigenous people are looking at, South Africans, looking at Black South Africans and how they've used truth commissions to redress the wrongs of the past in their own quest to redress these historical challenges that they too have had to confront. And here's a picture that I think really captures this transnational connection that I'm speaking with. These are two different pictures from two different countries, two different times. On the left, you have the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. On the right, you have the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And for me, this picture tells two key stories. The first story it tells is the transnational nature of this historical trauma, that these might be local issues, but in some ways they are also global traumas. But there are striking parallels between these experiences. But the second story that this picture tells is the centrality of women's experience to this trauma, to this grief. In both of the images, it is the woman, it is women, it is wives, mothers, sisters who've lost daughters, who lost children, who lost a generation, who lost their culture, who are the heart of the grief that Truth Commissions centers. And you can see this picture. One of the things that my colleagues at the center have done, and I've encouraged them to do, is to take pictures of Truth Commission hearings around the world and just compare the images and how in some ways these pictorial images tell the story of the global humanity that is at question in conversations about Truth Commissions. The picture on the left is a picture from the Tunisian Truth and Dignity Commission, recently established in the aftermath of the Tunisian Revolution in the Middle East. And on the right again, another picture from the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And there's a common story here. The grief, the racial trauma, the history of pain that Truth Commissions reveal through public hearing. And so I want to spend the next few minutes before the end of the talk to talk about why I think both the South African TRC and the Canadian TRC provide a model to the world, not so much in the sense of this is exactly how to do it, because I argue in my papers and in my research that there is no single model for a Truth Commission. I mean, every society must decide how to frame its Truth Commission based on the needs of the local people and based on what that society wants out of a Truth Commission. But I argue, and this is really the point of my conversation here today, that there is something about Truth Commissions beyond simply reducing lies. And that has to do with the memory question. So in South Africa, for instance, there's a big debate about whether the Truth Commission really helped the country to overcome apartheid. And you will find people on both sides of the argument. There is a new generation in South Africa, they call the born-free generations, that are increasingly and justifiably skeptical about the Truth Commission, that it achieved nothing. You know, that was the old generation. And they have a reason for that, because they see that society is still not just, that some of the historical atrocities have not been remedied, and that there's still much to be done. As this cartoon so eloquently portrays, there is a big gulf between truth and reconciliation. Here you have a picture of Desmond Tutu standing at the edge of a cliff of truth, but miles away from true reconciliation. And that is all true. And there are those who've derided the Truth Commission while it was sitting as the Kleenex Commission, you know, a place where people go to cry and weep about the past, but where nothing of any legal value really has happened, you know. So you have all these arguments that it brought truth without reconciliation. But herein lies, I think, the crux of the matter. Very few South Africans would argue with you about the success of the Truth Commissions in revealing the truth, or at least a narrative of the truth that has been long repressed. Now, a lot will say there was no reconciliation. A lot will say, you know, there was no victim-centered justice, adequate compensation was never paid. But few would argue with you that we do not know more about the atrocities of apartheid today because of the Truth Commission that we would otherwise not have known had there been no Truth Commission. For those who follow the South African Truth Commissions, these were public hearings in gymnasiums, in school gymnasiums, in town halls, where both victims and perpetrators came to tell their own stories. So in this sense, Michael Ignatieff is right. What the Truth Commission has done in this case is really reduce the number of lies about apartheid in the public domain in South Africa. What the nation has done with that revelation is a different question. But I, as a historian, I argue this is important. This is important work. It might not have led to justice and reconciliation at this time, but the knowing is an important part of that conversation. And the assertion of trauma, of the trauma of the Black communities who endured these years of suppression and atrocity. It's an important way of reframing the discourse of what the nation is. And a good example of why I think this is the case is the prominence that Ubuntu has come to play in South African national discourse. Now, there are many scholars who would argue that, well, Ubuntu is the invention of the ANC. There's nothing traditional about it. But this is a philosophy about collective humanity, the notion that if I dehumanize you, I ultimately dehumanize myself. That became the philosophical foundation of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But more than that, it has become the grand norm, or as they say, the legal foundation of the South African constitutional system and the South African human rights regime. So in some ways, one of the successes of the South African TRC, I would argue, and I am the first to acknowledge that there are many limitations, but that it gave the Black majority an opportunity to reinscribe their agenda, their histories into a national conversation from which they have been historically excluded. And for historians, it provides a treasure trove of resources with which we can re-narrate the histories. And that achievement, I would argue, should not be taken lightly. The Canadian model. What does Canada bring to the table? I would argue a lot, because Canada is the first Western nation to have adopted the Truth and Reconciliation model. Up until the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, truth and reconciliation as a paradigm of national justice was seen as something ideal for the global South, for the third world, for countries with weak judicial and political institutions in Africa, in Latin America, but that these models were ill-suited for Western democracies with robust judicial systems and political institutions. Well, Canada bucked the trend. With Canada opting for a Truth and Reconciliation model, I argue that it became obvious to political leaders, to policymakers, to those scholars involved in transitional justice, that, hey, look, this model, though a third world invention, can be appropriate. The West might not use truth commissions to deal with contemporary human rights violations. We have our courts, and we have the Canadian Human Rights Commission to do all that contemporary human rights violation adjudication. But it's a wonderful model for dealing with historical injustices and atrocities for which the traditional retributive justice model does not suffice. And so you begin to see that Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it's gaining a lot of attention. So for instance, in the conversation about the slavery Truth Commission in the United States, there's a lot of reference to the Canadian model and the limitations of that model. And I'm not arguing here, I have to make this clear. I am not by any stretch of the imagination arguing here that it's a model that is perfect. I mean, many people would refer to the inaction of the calls to action. I mean, with all its imperfection, my argument is that by opting for a Truth and Reconciliation model, which I have to stress was pushed not by the state, but by indigenous peoples themselves, Canada in some ways is blazing a trail in the potential that this model holds for the rest of the world, particularly those in the global north. So I'll just conclude with a few observations. So here we have some hard data, and this is the more boring part of the research that we do at the center, you know. So here you see coding. So what we've done, because we have such a rich database of Truth Commission records, both reports and auxiliary records, we have been able to code them using software like Invocations and Atlas TI to look at, you know, do a kind of rudimentary discourse analysis and textual analysis and all this fancy work you can do with quantitative analysis software these days, to look at how certain terminologies and ideas and frames shape the narratives of Truth Commission. So in this chart, for instance, you see the dominance of history. the Invocations of History in Truth Commission records. The highest we found in our research was in the records of the Mauritius Truth Commissions, which has a lot of invocations of history. Obviously, history was a key issue there. But very closely, you see Canada and South Africa, two truth commissions where history comes up again and again and again. The same is true about colonialism. We're looking at how does colonialism, imperialism, and the colonial experience features in narratives of truth and reconciliation. And there again, you see Canada and South Africa featuring very prominently. In Canada, in the context of the residential school, in South Africa, in the context of apartheid. So do truth commissions work? Concluding thoughts. I would say yes, but we have to recognize that truth commissions confront both progressive memory, which can help societies to understand their past in a liberating way, and retrogressive memory, which locks societies in a vicious circle of conflict and distrust. The challenge for Truth Commission, I think, is harnessing those progressive memories for truth-seeking, victim-centered justice, and national reconciliation. I thank you for listening.